In Tableau 2020.2, Tableau have added the ability for sets to be controlled with filter-like controls. I'm going to start this video backwards by actually showing you the finished product of what we're going to build right from the beginning. So here we have a map of London, and we're basically comparing the differences in averages across prices in different sort of postcodes. Okay, so the cool thing about this is it's got set actions already applied in the background. So I'm actually going to show you two ways of doing the same thing. When I select this particular region, you'll notice that the chart changes, and that's because it's comparing the average price against the selection that I've made. So when I make a selection, it changes the comparison point. And when I click on it again, it actually clears that selection and just compares it across the average of everything. Okay, so this makes it really, really interactive. I can actually sort of click on a particular part of London and see, well, how do house prices compare against this particular selection that I've made, or this other one here in E6. And notice as I do that, the selection I make gets a label. We've also got this information here in the tooltip. You'll notice the difference from the average is 0 because this is actually comparing itself against itself. So there is no difference. Yet if I go to the one above it, you'll see there's a difference of £53,000. Okay. Now the other thing you'll notice is that I've actually got that difference in average up here. So you can actually see that comparison straight up. Okay. So you can actually see the average price for the selection in this tooltip, so you actually know what you're working with. There's a lot of context here. Now the new feature in 2020.2 is the ability to control this using a filter-like interface. You can see right here that E11 there and E11 are the same, and I can actually go down in here and tick another selection and notice that the chart changes. Now this doesn't quite work as well because I've got a set action applied over here, but the selection only shows the mouse selection. So what I'd have to do for this to work is select several, and then you'd see the regions apply. But then those are also available here, and you can sort of play around with them and see how they work. Okay. So this is quite a complex bit of analysis we're doing. And in order to build it, we have to kind of start right from the basics by building the very basic chart. So that's what I'm going to show you how to do next. So the first thing we need to do is obviously connect to the data source and basically start looking at our data. So I've actually got a CSV file that I'm going to be connecting to here. It's just on my desktop. If I go to my desktop here, go to 2020.2, you'll see that I've got this London house data available to me. Now, this example is actually modified ever so slightly from the beta test scenario that we were asked to test this feature, if that makes sense. So I've made it slightly simpler for the purpose of this tutorial, but it's essentially the same data if you've been using the Tableau beta. Okay, so let's go into the sheet, and you'll see that we have our data sources here on the left-hand side. For those of you wondering why I can't see dimensions and measures, that's because in this version, the data model has been rolled out. So that slight distinction between dimensions and measures is now only really seen when you try and drag items between the two sections. You can see this very subtle line that does that sort of distinction. Okay, so let's start building our chart, and I'll sort of talk through the problem as I build this, and I really sort of ask that you bear with me as I walk you through this, because this can be a bit of a mind maze, but we're going to get there and we'll build this chart. So I'm going to right click my data source, and then I'm going to take an extract. The reason I'm doing this is because it makes the data source faster. Okay, so it just makes working with this, especially in a demo that I'm doing right now, much faster. And I know it's an extract because if you see here, you'll see these two cylinders and an arrow going between them. That lets me know that it's a Tableau data extract. It's actually using the hyper file format. Okay. Now, the next thing we'd like to do is to just visualize the information that we have. Okay, this can be slightly sort of cumbersome because I'm dealing with spatial data, and yet I have no real information here that sort of signals spatial information other than a postcode and a postcode area. So let me just double click these and just see what happens. You'll notice that there's obviously an issue there, so that doesn't work. It's not recognizing the postcodes properly. So what I normally do is I try the other one that I have in my dataset just to see if that sort of yields different results. And if I double click that as well, you'll see I also have the same issue. Okay, so I'm having a slight problem here, just basically figuring out what's actually going on. Okay, now what I need to do is I need to actually define that this outcode. If I just describe this field here, you see this outcode, this is actually the spatial information that I want to work with. So I'm going to click close and I'm going to go right click on outcode. And I'm going to go to geographic role and I'm actually going to assign this a postcode. Okay. And when I do that, then double click that, you'll see I now get the spatial information that I want. So just always bear with the data source. Sometimes it's not where you expect it to be and you might just need to do some work to make things work out. Now you can see dots here, and that's great because it tells me exactly where the centroid of that particular postcode is. But what I'd actually need to do is actually make a field map. So in order to do this, there's one place to do this every single time, and it's the marks card over here. So in the marks card, if you select the drop down, you'll see you get different chart types. And actually, we want Tableau to not use the automatic suggestion here, which is a circle, and instead use a map. And when I change that, you now see that we've got the outcodes nicely sort of shaped out. This information is actually held inside of Tableau. It has something called a Firebird database that has all this information, and that's where it's getting the spatial information to draw this detail onto the map. Now, the next thing we probably need to do is just to style this a little bit before we move on. It's easy to do it now rather than later. So I'm going to go to the map layers at the very top by clicking on map and then going down to the second to last option. Now, once we're there, we can add some detail onto the map. I'm going to add streets because that always helps to give some point of context on a map. And you can obviously, be more fancy with these other map styles, but I actually want to keep this fairly simple. And what I'd like to do is add some context that's relevant to what we're looking at. So I'm going to add the postcode boundaries and the postcode labels, so we can sort of get a sense of which postcodes are covered and which aren't covered in our analysis. Okay. The last change I'm going to make is by making the border of each of these shapes white. So I'm going to go down here to the border options and I'm just going to select the white option, and you'll see that that now sits a lot better. And I might just change this transparency ever so slightly more, just so that it's a little bit lighter on the eyes. Okay, so we've done some basic formatting here now, and we're pretty much ready to start doing our analysis. And what is key here is sort of highlighting the challenge that we have. So let's take another look at that in more detail. Now, typically when you get to this view, the first thing you do is you'd probably just take the price and place that on color. So let's just do that very quickly and see what issues we have. Well, if I just put the price, then obviously the area with the most properties is going to have the sort of largest price. So we need to look at the average price. Okay, so we need to go in here to this aggregation, which is green here, which says sum, and we need to change that to an average. And now that we've done that, we're now looking at the averages, and you can start to see where we have a little bit of an issue here, because obviously in a place like London or even New York, any city in the world, there are going to be areas which have an average price higher than the rest of the areas. And the point with this sort of analysis is that actually, when we just think about this a second, it's no use just basically always having the context driven by some of these more expensive areas. You can see here that my legend here is sort of got a very big range here, and it's very difficult actually to make any sort of sense of this. What would be more powerful would be if I was maybe able to select a region and then see how that price or the average price in that region compares to the average price in other regions. Okay, so that would be a much better form of analysis. But in order to do that, we're going to have to build up a set of calculations that do a couple of things. The first thing it needs to be able to do is to understand the selection we've made. The second thing we need to do is to be able to calculate the average price, not just for that selection, but for everything else that we haven't selected. And then the last thing we need to do is obviously calculate the difference between those two things. So in order to do that, of course, we do that in Tableau using a calculation. So let's go ahead and create these calculations now. I'm first going to remove the price off the color so that we can just have sort of a neutral set of context. And when I'm working with calculations for a long while, I tend to move my calculation window all the way out just by dragging this line and moving it out, as you can see that I'm doing here. I then right click on any white space and I just simply create calculated field. If you're wondering how to get this information tab open, there's this little caret here that you can just click open, and that opens up this view here, and you can just see some little hints. I tend to leave that open. It's a shame that you can't leave it open whilst you're resizing that, so that's what I'm just doing there. And now we're pretty much ready to go and start creating our calculations. Right, the first thing we need to do is simply to create a set. And actually, in order to do that, we don't need this calculation window. So let's just go and right click, create and set. And that's pretty much it. We've created a set very quickly. And the thing about this set is we don't actually care what's in it. We're going to be dynamically selecting items. So initially, I'm just going to use all the options available to me. I've just sort of ticked this option here, use all, and that saves me having to make some selections. Then click OK, and now we have our outcode set. The next step is to create a calculation that basically checks that set to make sure if we've made a selection or not. Okay, so this is a very simple calculation. We basically just say if the item we've selected is in the outcode set, that's how you sort of define that in Tableau, then I'd like to look at the price essentially. So we're just basically isolating the selection and the price for that selection, and that's pretty much it. Okay. We can call this selected price, or we can call it whatever we want. Okay, so I'll just call this selected price. Then I'm going to hit OK. So we've got our first calculation. Okay, now the next calculation we need to do is slightly more complicated, and I'm going to try and explain this as I type it. What we need to do is basically calculate the average price for the selection I've made. Okay. And we need to make sure that it's taking into context the selection. It sounds like a bit of a tongue twister. I'm using the same word to describe the same thing, but really bear with me here. I'm going to use something called the level of detail calculation. Okay, and in this particular case, I'm using the exclude function in that calculation. Okay, and the thing I need to exclude from my aggregation in this particular case is the selection. You can see here, an exclude computes an aggregate excluding the specified dimensions if present in the view. So you see here, I've got my outcode present in the view, and I'd like to exclude that from my aggregation. And the aggregation I'm going to do is going to be the average price for the selected, price essentially. So let's go ahead and type this out. Bring the outcode, I do a colon there, then I do average, and we're going for the selected price here. Okay, and that's pretty much the calculation in a nutshell. So just to go over that one more time, I'm asking Tableau to do a calculation here where it calculates the average of the selected price, the previous calculation we created, excluding this outcode in the analysis. So what that will do is it will give me an average for everything in the visualization. So we can basically pretty much compare that. Okay, so let's just give this a name. Okay, so we've got a calculation available to us here, and then I'm going to click apply, and now we can see that available to us just here. Now the last calculation is a little bit simpler. We just basically need to do some maths to get the average price. So let's just type AVG, type in price, minus, and this is a key one, minus the average of the average price for selection, if that makes sense. Okay, and you're probably wondering, why on earth am I doing an average of an average? Well, it's just because of basically the way this calculation works. If we just remind ourselves what's inside of this calculation, if I click inside of it, you'll see here what it's doing is it's basically taking it's basically excluding this outcode from the analysis. Okay, and this average price isn't doing that. So by doing that, we create these two contrasting values. One which only takes into account the selection that I've made. Mind you, there's multiple sort of properties and cells in that particular sort of region that I select. And then on this one, on the one on the left, it's not excluding the outcode from the analysis. So it's actually calculating the average price for each outcode. So you can add a comment here just to sort of make it easy to see. So average price computes the average for each outcode. And the second one, the average of the average price for selection, computes just the average for the selection I've made. Okay, so that's how you do comments in Tableau. It's very useful to add that in, and I'll leave that in the calculation. Apologies for any typos while I record this. I'm notoriously bad at spelling. And so we just need to give this a name, and this is essentially the difference from the average. Okay, so I'm just going to call this difference from the average. Okay, and then now that calculation is valid, I can hit apply, and now we have our calculation here on the left hand side. We finished the bulk of calculations, and now we can start adding this context onto the chart. Okay, the next step is to bring a few more items into the visualization. So the first thing we're going to do is to bring the difference from the average onto color, and you'll see that that immediately colors some of the items. Okay, you can see that it's an aggregate calculation. And then the next thing to do is to bring the average price for the selection just onto the detail. What this does is it brings it into context should we need to use it a little bit later on, because we need to be sort of aware of what's going on when these calculations are being done. And so we want to be able to add a nice label at the top to show the values that are being used in the calculation. Now, if I just hover over some of these, you can actually see the calculation starting to work. The average price for the selection is currently 723,292, and this is actually the total for the entire data set. Whereas for this property, E11, the difference from the average is through 232,701. So the thing that might make sense here to add might be just the average price. So let's add that in so we know that value in each of these data sets. So let's just make that an average. We'll put that on the tooltip rather than on detail. I'll just click on that small icon, select tooltip, and now you'll see here that I can actually see those values playing out. The average price is 490,591, and you can see it's a difference of 232,000 from the 723 average across the entire data set. So this is actually starting to do the job that we wanted it to do. Now, what it's not doing at the moment is when I select something, you can see the values aren't just changing yet. And that's because that's the kind of change that we apply on the data set when it's in a dashboard. These are essentially actions that are applied, hence the term set actions and set controls. Those are typically applied at the dashboard level. Now, the last thing I want to do is probably give some date parameters to this. So I'm going to drag date onto the filters, okay? And I'm going to use a range of dates and just click next. I can sort of choose a bunch of different ways of doing this. I'll click OK, because what I'll do is I tend to prefer to show these in a slightly different format. So if I click on this drop down, then I get this sort of nice period analysis, right? So I can actually say browse periods, and that will change this sort of filter. And if you choose over the last day, well, there's no sale in this data set that's happened in the last day, or probably week or month. But if I go back a year or maybe even 5 years, then that really does bring into context everything that we need. Okay, you can obviously change that again and maybe choose like a starting point and an end point, or even just, you know, looking at these items. I think the issue with the browse periods is I can actually probably edit it ever so slightly to anchor relative to the largest date. Rather than today, I can actually anchor this relative to a specific period of time. So I don't know when the last house sale was in this data set. If I just look at this, 2015, if we just go back maybe to let's just go back to 2018. I think that should cover us off pretty well. And then we can just restrict the data set that way. So just go back to you know, use that, and then that should be just about fine. Yeah, that's about right. Okay, cool. So now that we've got this, The next bit of analysis we need to do is to make this a dashboard and essentially make it easy to be able to change this around. So I'm going to create a new dashboard just by doing that. Then I'm just going to bring this sheet in, and immediately it brings in all the controls that we're used to. I'm also just going to zoom in. If I remove this little pin here, what it does is it makes the map fit the space that it's actually available to fit in. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to change this title a little bit. I'll just call this difference. Okay. You could use the percentage difference, but I'm just going to use the term difference in this particular case. And I'm also going to add a couple of things. So I'm going to add the average price in the selected region. Okay. And this value is going to come from this particular sheet. Okay, so if you click insert and then go down to the average price selection, it actually gets the value and inserts that into the very top. And I'll just drop it down 2 sizes so it's clear that this is a meaningful sort of different subtitle. And so you can see there now that this is working, and this is working really, really nicely. Now, the other thing I need to do is to actually put my set into the filters. And the reason that is because I'm going to be using some interactivity in this particular visualization. And notice when I drag this in, it doesn't actually sort of present in the same way that I want it to present. I want it to show what's in and out of the set. So what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to leave this out, and then we're going to come back to this when it's been built, so we can see sort of the finished result and why the filters behave the way they do. Now, the last thing to do is to add some action. So if I go over here to actions, then add an action, and here you'll see a bunch of options. The thing we're most interested in is to change the set of values. Okay, and so what we're trying to do is to change set values. That's what I'll name that. And we want to do it on a selection, so that's absolutely correct. And the set we're trying to influence is this outcode set. Okay, and so when I make a selection, it's going to change the values of this set. It's currently got everything selected. So at the moment, everything's in the set. But when I make a selection, one thing will be in the set or 2 things will be in the set. Then that will become our comparison. Okay. So I'm just going to click OK, and then click OK again. And now, as I make a selection, you can actually sort of see that this axis up here is changing. And you notice that the color range is changing. You can just see it very subtly in the background. But we kind of have a problem here because it's fading out the items, we can't actually see the visualization. So we need to do one more thing, and this is a bit of a hack. Okay, we go into the sheet and we just create a new calculated field, and we're just going to call this highlight. Okay. In fact, this is already in the dataset because I was creating this earlier on, and it's baked into the dataset, into the CSV. So I don't actually need to do anything here. I can just bring this in. But let's just assume that you didn't have that available to you. You just basically need to type a calculation in. It can be absolutely anything. It can be, you know, elephant, whatever. You just need to create a calculation and just put some text inside of it. Sometimes I use the term all, and that will do exactly the same thing. So I'll do that. I'll use this new one that I've created so you can just see the process. Okay. And I'm going to put that in front of my item. And then the last thing I want to do is obviously hide these headers so that you can't see that. Then when I go back to my dashboard and I go to dashboard actions, I want to add something called a highlight action. And if you just see here, the second option here is a highlight action. So when I click on that, you'll see that I get this interface. And basically what it's going to do is it's going to apply this highlight to itself. So it has this effect of basically selecting itself whenever I make a selection. Okay. And that was actually going to come first. You can see there that it goes to the top. I'm going to click OK and go back out. And now watch what happens when I make a selection. I actually maintain the context of the visualization. It doesn't fade it out into the background. So that's a nice little hack that you can use to sort of maintain selections if you're trying to sort of analyze some information. And now you can see that as I'm clicking around, it's calculating the difference from the average. And you can see that as I hover around. You can even see the average price for the selected region that I'm in. Okay. Okay, so now that we've built this out, you can see that we now need to get onto the new feature, which is the set control. This selection is working, but the whole point of this feature is that I can actually choose these just by using a drop-down filter, which is similar to sort of this sort of interface up here. So let's go ahead and just figure out how to do that. If we go into the sheet, what I need to do is bring this outcode set into the filter pane, okay? Then I need to change that into a show in and out of set sort of option, okay? And I'm just going to again use all and click OK, and then go back to the dashboard. And then when I go back to the dashboard, you'll see now that I have this option to show the set control. And when I click on that, I now get the full list of items that are actually available in the set. And you can actually see that everything is ticked. So right now it's comparing everything against the average of everything. And when I make a selection here, in this case E17, you can see that that selection changes to E17. If I do the same again for E11, you can see it changes there, and so on and so forth. So you get the idea. This control is doing exactly the same as my selection. So let's have a go at doing that. Let's deselect. Select E2, there you go. Select E3, there you go. And the great thing is this has sort of the capabilities of a normal filter. I can actually even do a single value drop down, which would make the most sense here because you never want to really look at multiple items at the same time. In this analysis, you can just go down here and choose different items, and you can see the chart is updating a little bit more, okay? And so that's pretty much the feature in a nutshell. Okay, we've pretty much built everything we need to build out. The only thing we've got left are some flourishes to make this a lot clearer to see. You can see here that the color range is a little bit sort of extraordinary because it's sort of all skewed towards one end. So I'd like to make this so that the legend is a little bit more balanced. So we can just go ahead here and edit the colors, and we can actually change this a little bit. So we can set it to be, go from minus 500,000 and end at plus 500,000. So anything over 500,000, which is pretty much, more than I could ever afford, that will automatically sort of go to that end. So now you have a much more balanced scale, and you can see that that immediately improves the way this chart works. And now as we start to use some of these items here, it's much easier to see. Okay. Now the other thing to make sure is to make sure that the legend is the right way around. Like when I select this option here, you can see here that the difference does correctly reflect the direction. Sometimes you can end up with a legend that incorrectly sort of reflects what's going on in terms of the range. So just make sure your colors line up, where red is not so good and blue is a little bit better. We're not using red and green because of being sort of colorblind aware for those who have visual impairments. Now, the other thing we did in the initial example I showed you is we added a label for these selections. So that's actually done inside of the chart. So if I go over here, you can see that I have this label option. But what I need to do is essentially bring the outcode itself onto the label. Okay, and when I do that, you'll see it labels every single one, and that's not what I want to achieve. So what I do instead is I go back into label, and then I have some options here of how to apply those labels. So I'm only going to choose those that are selected, okay? And then now what that does is when I make a selection, that label shows up, and then when I deselect, it disappears. If I select multiple items, they all show up too. So it's much easier to see what's going on. So now let's go back to the dashboard, and when we click on an item, we can see that that's the case, and now that's working exactly as we expected. And it's much nicer way to sort of play around with this data and work. And so that's pretty much it. We've rebuilt the chart that we started out with, and it's much easier to see sort of what's going on. If you've enjoyed this video, thanks for watching. Hit the like button, hit subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video.